to the college and many, many students. She's been an instructor in the English department and continues to teach, but her primary role now is as a teacher, mentor, patron, saint, and guardian angel in the Academic Resource Center for many, many students. She's a huge, huge help and resource. Tonight, she's going to be talking, and I'll let her describe the work that she's done with Wounded Warriors through a grant with the New Hampshire Humanities Council, using literature, classical literature, the Odyssey, primarily to help heal the wounds of veterans of recent wars. And I think it's been a remarkable experience for her and certainly for the people that have benefited from it. So I'll let her describe that work. So our general topic tonight is how stories can help us heal, and she'll speak specifically to how she has done that work and witnessed it with the people that she's been able to work with. About a half-hour presentation from Professor Contarino, and then about a half hour of questions and answers from you. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to my good dear friend, Anne Maria Contarino.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, everybody. I am very new to this technology, but I'll do my best here. I want to thank, first of all, Professor Bouchard and everyone at the Humanities Institute, Patrice Russell, and everyone at Alumni Events, IT, of course, for making this possible, and most important to you for tuning in. I have some prepared remarks, and then we'll move on to questions that you may have. Tonight I want to talk about a project called From Troy to Baghdad. But first, in a broader sense, to talk about the power of literature and storytelling, and even more broadly to talk about the ability of the liberal arts to connect us to the arc of humanity and its enduring questions and mysteries. A very fitting thing to do on the feast day of St. Anselm of Canterbury. Storytelling is a powerful thing. Entrancing, distracting, cathartic, commemorative, didactic, salvific. From 1001 Nights to Boccaccio's Decameron, from the songs of ancient bards to the parables of Jesus, from Desdemona's seduction by Othello's tales of war and hardship, to Hamlet's dying plea to Horatio. Always there is an imperative to get the story right and to marvel at what it can do. Storytelling in all of its components is a social act. Whether we're reading stories, writing them, telling them, or hearing them, we are one party in a communicational contract between author/narrator and audience. We presuppose that the narrative is ordered in a way that distinguishes it from lived experience. We assume that the content has meaning, whether intentional or otherwise, and we accept responsibility for extracting and even contributing to that meaning through our role in the transaction. In The Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien's collection of stories based on his experience in Vietnam, O'Brien talks of his storytelling in this way, quote, "I did not look on my work as therapy. I still don't. But it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience. You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths. You make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, and you carry it forward by inventing incidents that did not in fact occur, but that nonetheless help to clarify and explain." So, as readers, writers, narrators, or listeners, we impose order and we look for meaning. But we also understand that stories are slippery and that they take on lives of their own. Like Sister Ursula, the main character in Richard Russo's remarkable short story, The Horse Child, who writes a brutally honest autobiographical tale, we may find that our stories reveal truths even we ourselves don't know. As I'm very fond of saying, there are some books that we read and some books that read us. Why is storytelling such a powerful thing? because stories allow us to achieve a beautiful, poignant, almost unbearable balance between control and surrender. Let me tell you a little bit about my own story for those of you who don't know me. I'm a classicist by training, a Miltonist by profession, and a humanist by vocation. In the past number of years, I've seen these three parallel lines in my life converge to a point of fulfilling synthesis. How I shape my responsibilities at work grows directly out of how I live my life day to day, and both are informed by the values I prize most. In this, I'm so very fortunate. I taught my first class in the fall semester of 1985, a course in Shakespeare's English history plays at the University of Pennsylvania when I was in graduate school. And this year, I will complete 25 years of teaching at St. Anselm. I have loved every minute of it, but I can honestly say that nothing has brought me more joy than the opportunities I've had to bring literature out of the classroom and into the community. One of these opportunities came a few years ago, thanks to a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and a program from New Hampshire Humanities called From Troy to Baghdad. Let me just tell you a little bit about that program. It began with a classicist named Roberta Stewart. She's a Roman historian at Dartmouth. And in conjunction with Dartmouth's program, the Dartmouth Undergraduate Veterans Association, Roberta began to offer group readings of the Odyssey to veterans participating in the program at Dartmouth. And she began to see a remarkable thing happening, that veterans were latching onto the text even though they were not classicists, and they were using that text to explore their own experience and then to articulate some of their own experience. And so she helped New Hampshire Humanities write a grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities to bring some funding and some more exposure to her own work at Dartmouth. And she conducted a series of 3 weekend-long trainings up at Dartmouth over the summer to help people learn to participate in this program called From Troy to Baghdad. I was one of the trainees there, and I became a facilitator in a veterans group. We met for 14 weeks when we read the Odyssey from cover to cover, veterans only, and 3 facilitators, a humanist, myself, a clinician of some kind, and then a veteran as well. We read the Odyssey with a group of veterans who were facing difficulty with reintegration after military service. In my own group, we had largely Vietnam veterans, although we expected more from Afghanistan and Iraq. But we had mostly Vietnam veterans. In that first iteration, I was the only person in the room without any military experience. I was the only woman in the room. I was the only humanist in the room. And somehow, through the magic of Homer and people's goodwill, we meshed into a wonderful group. Subsequent to that, I became the trainer for new facilitators across the state of New Hampshire. We launched 5 new groups. And in the second iteration of the program, we had a 10-week session, which we opened to veterans and their spouses and families. Currently, the groups are no longer meeting, although I have a splinter group that meets on our own. But hopefully in the future, we'll be able to get some more funding and continue the program. Roberta, as far as I know, is still continuing her own work at Dartmouth. The ultimate goal of the groups, and the most important thing we were all invested in, was this effort to help veterans heal. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how the groups progressed and how we managed to do that. So my discussion of From Troy to Baghdad tonight is going to pose 2 big questions. The first question is, why use a literary text to address a problem that is regarded as largely psychological, medical, sociological, even political, but certainly not literary, certainly not aesthetic, certainly not linked to the liberal arts in any concrete way? Why? Because even though literature evokes powerful emotions, we now, for example, use trigger warnings in literature classes all the time, still it constitutes a safe space. In literature, we observe instead of participating directly in the action, and therefore we experience indirectly. We may even perhaps take a prurient pleasure in what we see, or adopt a perspective we might not dare to in our real lives. We can project ourselves into a situation and examine what's happening to characters, even though we might not be able to look directly at the fact that those things have also happened to us. I'm a Platonist to my bones, so there's not much about Aristotle that I would agree with, but his ideas about tragedy are right on the money. Tragedy is an imitation of an action that elicits pity and fear and brings about a catharsis, the famous quote from the Poetics. We watch, we emote, we feel better, we go home, and nobody gets hurt. To illustrate this principle, I'd like to take a look not at Homer, but at the first text I use in the facilitator training in From Troy to Baghdad, and the introductory text I chose to read with my veterans groups. It's one of two archetypal homecoming narratives from written tradition, the story of the prodigal son from chapter 15 of the Gospel of Luke. I won't read the text because I trust that we're all familiar with the bones of the story, but I would like to look at some important aspects of homecoming that this story brings to light. First, the person coming home may have mixed feelings, mixed motives, and may see himself or herself in a conflicted way. The prodigal son's motives are mixed, and his expectations are a cause for anxiety. It's not easy to fit this story into a boy makes a mistake and learns his lesson paradigm. We don't really know his feelings about going home. Maybe he's sorry. Maybe he's trying to figure out how to play it so he'll get out of his terrible situation and be accepted back home. Second, not everybody is happy to see someone come home. We see the different responses in this parable of the father and the brother. Resentment and joy, both somewhat valid, but also each person's response reveals important things about him and about the person coming home. Homecoming is a dynamic that requires cooperation from all parties concerned. And finally, we want to put this story back in its narrative context. It's not presented to us as an historical narrative. It's a parable that Jesus is using to illustrate a larger point. It shows the gentle didacticism of his storytelling. Jesus is issuing an invitation, not pointing an accusatory finger or assigning blame. Jesus is saying, look at this example and see how you relate to it. So Jesus is just answering our first question. Why use literature? The second question I want to address is more specific. Why use Homer's Odyssey, a classical text that many people see as intimidating or, quite frankly, boring? One of those books that we should have read but never did. Why? Because it's the other archetypal homecoming narrative, part of Western collective consciousness and memory. We all know some specific parts of the story, whether we read it or not, and we all know the overall arc of the story. Odysseus' struggle to get home physically, and his subsequent struggle to achieve homecoming in a meaningful sense once he gets there. The Odyssey shows us that homecoming isn't an isolated event. It's a slow, deliberate, painful process. Even when a homecoming narrative has a happy ending, there's a bittersweetness that runs through it. Part of this swirling of bitter and sweet, of course, comes from the fact that Odysseus is a warrior, a veteran returning from military service in a war with a questionable cause. While he fights to win his own homecoming, he mourns the loss of less fortunate comrades. While he longs for the peacefulness of home, he loves the thrill of military strategy and battle. And he knows that leaving the war behind is a concept that makes sense only to those who have never been there. In case the Odyssey is one of those books you've never read, here's an introduction. Like the Iliad, Homer's Odyssey is a long narrative poem written in dactylic hexameter and divided by modern editors into 24 books. It tells the story of the Greek warrior Odysseus, not at Troy during the war, but on his journey home to the small island of Ithaca where he's king. In Book 9 of the Iliad, Achilles reveals that he can choose between two destinies, a short life filled with great glory, kleos, or a long life with no glory, but a successful homecoming, nostos. Given Achilles' choice to return to battle after a long hiatus, the Iliad becomes a poem about kleos, what it means, how it's won, and what it costs. The Odyssey, on the other hand, is a poem about nostos, homecoming, and what Odysseus must learn and endure in order to win it. The present tense or present action of the Odyssey takes place 20 years after the start of the Trojan War and 10 years after its end. No one knows anything about Odysseus' whereabouts. The state of things in Ithaca is dire. Social order and civic justice have broken down since there is no one to command authority. Many suitors wishing to marry Penelope and take over the kingdom have moved into Odysseus' palace. Collectively, they are a symbol of the disorder that reigns. Penelope, for her part, resists completely, using any means she can to keep the suitors at bay because she still hopes for Odysseus' return. Finally, Odysseus' son Telemachus is having an identity crisis of sorts. He's a young man of 20 who, in ordinary circumstances, would be coming of age into an adult life defined by royal privilege and honor. Instead, he's stuck in a kind of limbo, burdened by the legacy of a father he doesn't know or remember, belittled by other men who seek to marry his mother and disinherit him, and unable to wrest authority for himself since Penelope insists that Odysseus will return. Clearly, Odysseus is the most important figure in Ithaca, even though he hasn't actually been there in 20 years. The opening of Book 5 finds Odysseus in a kind of suspended present as well, sitting on the beach crying and waiting to go home. After a short span of present tense action, Odysseus finds himself at the palace of King Alcinous, where he relates, in a series of flashbacks, the tales of his adventures. Thus, in Books 6 through 12, Odysseus becomes the only narrator of the poem, as he relates in the present tense the things he has experienced in the past. He compresses the action of 10 years into a story told over the course of an evening. The action of Books 12 through 24, fully one half of the poem, tells the story of only a matter of days, when Odysseus returns to Ithaca and routs the suitors from his palace. Two themes in the Odyssey sparked especially intense discussion in our veterans group, and I'd like to examine them here, but I should say that the rules of confidentiality will limit the kinds of things I can share. Our discussion sessions were understood to be closed sessions, and so there's much I can't repeat, but I certainly can give you a sense of the intensity of the things we did talk about. So first, let's go back to the idea of homecoming as an ongoing process, particularly with respect to relationships, marriage, and family. As I mentioned earlier, Homer devotes fully one half of the poem to the few days between when Odysseus returns to Ithaca and when he retakes control of his kingdom. Once Odysseus gets back to Ithaca, he literally walks from the periphery of the island to its center. From the beach where he awakens, to the countryside and onto his estate, stopping at the hut of his swineherd Eumaeus, into the city and the courtyard of his palace, then into the dining hall where he assesses the situation with the suitors, into the inner family quarters where he converses with Penelope, into his bedroom, and finally into his bed, where he and Penelope renew their physical intimacy. At each stage, Odysseus gathers information about his kingdom, home, and family. He gradually rebuilds the relationships that had lapsed during his absence, and most importantly, he reclaims his sense of self. And so slowly, he reintegrates. At Eumaeus' hut, for example, he reveals himself to Telemachus, and he establishes himself as a father and as an authority figure on his property. At the house, he routs the suitors and orders the execution of the faithless housemaids, thereby taking command of his domestic authority. At this point, however, it's Penelope who takes control of Odysseus's final reassimilation into his role as husband by tricking him into revealing a secret only the two of them would know. I won't spoil the surprise in case you have yet to read the poem, but I do think that the description of Penelope's response is worth reading closely. So I'm going to read you a quote from book 23 of the Odyssey. Odysseus and Penelope finally reunite, and she throws her arms around him. He wept as he held his lovely wife, whose thoughts were virtuous. And as when the land appears welcome to men who are swimming, after Poseidon has smashed their strong-built ship on the open water, pounding it with the weight of wind and the heavy seas, and only a few escape the gray water landward by swimming, with a thick scurf of salt coated upon them, and gladly they set foot on the shore, escaping the evil. So welcome was her husband to her as she looked upon him, and she could not let him go for an embrace of her white arms. So aside from being one of the most beautiful passages in the poem, I love that passage because you can see in it that the structure of the poem and the language of the poem really replicates the theme. And as Odysseus is getting closer to full reintegration, you'll notice that the simile here is a very curious one. In grade school, we learned the definition of similes, right? Two unlike things yoked together with like or as for the purpose of comparison. But here, the tenor and the vehicle of the simile are not unlike things. Odysseus is not just like a man who's been battered on the sea by Poseidon and shipwrecked and swum to shore full of salt and scurf and is glad to see land. He is that man, and Penelope recognizes him as that man. And in that moment, when they come together and they embrace, the simile kind of collapses on itself, and the linguistic structure resolves itself into two things that are exactly alike. It's a wonderful moment in the poem, and because I'm sitting here at home by myself, I am controlling myself. But if I were in class, I would be jumping up and down because the simile is one of my favorite things in the poem. Okay, so the veterans in my first group, mostly Vietnam vets, didn't get so excited about the simile, but they did express profound guilt and regret for the ways in which they felt unavailable to the people who loved them most, their wives and children. Some revealed that they had not, in fact, ever married or had children because they felt incapable of genuine intimacy after the war. Others explained the toll that alcohol or substance abuse had taken on their marriages. Many revealed that they had never spoken to their wives or children about their experiences in the war. How could I tell them the things I've seen and done? What would they think of me? What sense could they make of it? My first group contained a father and son, both veterans, who had never discussed their feelings about their military service, nor did each one know that the other one was enrolled in the group. They never had a direct exchange during our discussions, but they both talked about Odysseus and Telemachus' relationship a lot. And it was clear that they had found a method of talking to each other by talking about the two characters in the poem. A few weeks into the program, a number of vets asked if their wives could sit in on a session or two. The group voted against this suggestion because we had agreed to closed sessions, but some of the men gave the Odyssey to their wives to read, and when our second group began to meet some months afterward, a number of veterans returned for a second read with their wives. Clearly, they saw an opportunity to communicate through the poem things they had not been able to share directly. The second theme I'd like to explore is the theme of storytelling. In the minds of most readers, the Odyssey is a classic adventure story. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, Circe turning men into swine. Though Homer couches many of Odysseus's homecoming struggles as thrilling adventures, each still presents a dangerous detour for Odysseus to navigate. Some brutal and ugly, some seductive and tempting. It's not difficult to read these adventures metaphorically as battles with drug use, alcohol, infidelity, thrill-seeking, and post-traumatic stress. And our veterans did just that. The most pervasive activity in the poem, however, is storytelling, the process through which we translate experience into narrative by imposing order and crafting it for a particular audience and a particular purpose. As I mentioned earlier, all of his adventures are presented as stories that Odysseus tells the Phaeacians in order to win their sympathy and their help in transporting him to Ithaca. Because Odysseus is the only narrator here, we have no other corroborating voice in the poem for these adventures. Are the adventures accurate? Did they even happen at all? Does the story accomplish what Odysseus needs it to accomplish? Does accuracy even matter if our goal is to get someone to understand a deeper truth? One of my veterans answered these questions this way. The truth is that the Phaeacians could never understand what happened to Odysseus, no matter what he said. The truth is that Odysseus is in pain all the time. He's just trying to alleviate some of that pain. I get that. His response stopped me in my tracks. I had never thought of Odysseus in this way, and in an attempt to lighten the sadness that was becoming more pervasive in the room, I offered a quote from Book 11, when Odysseus visits the underworld, and the prophet Tiresias foretells that Odysseus will make one final voyage. And I'll share that quote with you now. Tiresias says to Odysseus, after you have killed the suitors in your own palace, either by treachery or openly with the sharp bronze, then you must take up your well-shaped oar and go on a journey until you come where there are men living who know nothing of the sea and who eat food that is not mixed with salt, who never have known ships whose cheeks are painted purple, who never have known well-shaped oars which act for ships as wings do. And I will tell you a very clear proof, and you cannot miss it. When, as you walk, some other wayfarer happens to meet you and says you carry a winnowing fan on your bright shoulder, then you must plant your well-shaped oar in the ground and render ceremonious sacrifice to the Lord Poseidon, one ram and one bull and a mounter of sows, a boar pig, and make your way home again and render holy hecatombs to the immortal gods who hold the wide heaven, all of them in order. Death will come to you from the sea in some altogether unwarlike way, and it will end you in the ebbing time of a sleek old age. Your people about you will be prosperous. All this is true that I tell you. I have always found this passage comforting, because it assures Odysseus that his struggles are finite. Ultimately, he will find people who don't know what war is, and then he can rest in prosperity. But the veterans in my first group had a completely different response. They saw the promise of healing as a phantom, as insubstantial as the ghosts in Book 11. There are no people who don't know what war is. Never have been, never will be. One veteran put it this way: we keep talking about coming home as a way to leave the war behind. Odysseus can't leave the war behind because the war's inside. That's the truth of the story. If homecoming is a process, then healing is as well. A long, intricate, painful process, recursive, not linear, and most likely only partially successful. I set out on this voyage from Troy to Baghdad as the expert on Homer, and I learned more in 14 weeks than I had in the 35 years previous. One poem, written as long as 5,000 years ago, resonated with a group of inexperienced, somewhat reluctant readers in ways I never could have imagined, and wove us together as a human community wrestling the same demons. Of course, seeing these common threads cannot eradicate the isolation felt by each veteran, but these discussion groups allowed veterans to undertake the reading as a community, and what's more important, to pursue their ongoing reintegration in solidarity. No one would presume that reading one text or having a series of conversations can heal what Jonathan Shea and Philip Clay have called the moral injury of military service. But it can do a number of remarkable things. It can foster understanding, ease burdens, build bridges, give voice. Homer knew above all things the transcendent power of storytelling. At the end of the Odyssey's opening invocation, he instructs his muse to launch out on Odysseus' story. Daughter of Zeus, start from where you will and sing for our time too. We are going to need singers and storytellers for our time. How will we tell the story of this COVID-19 pandemic? The lives sacrificed and lost, the chaos won by first responders and other essential workers, the no story of survivors, the loss, anger, frustration, and rejoicing. With God's grace, telling and listening to our stories will help us to process and to heal. Thank you. Shall we open it up to some questions? Unmute ourselves and see what people have to say. Jerry, it's nice to see you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for this. This was fantastic.
You're welcome. How are you?
Yeah. Doing great. Sitting here with my pup on my lap. We'll have to talk soon, but
Okay.
I guess like John in the comments, John Gallivan had a nice observation there and a question for you.
Oh, hi, John. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Similarly, this made me think of a story that we read in one of my classes at St. A's by Andre Dubus called A Hemingway Story.
Yes.
I came back to that recently, actually, and just wanted to share that, you know, I love your reflection and I admire the work that you did with the soldiers and appreciate your willingness to share it with us. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Do you have anything you'd like to say about a Hemingway story?
Oh gosh, just that when I was briefly teaching English at a community college, I used to teach that work, and I found that the students, you know, it was all about meaning. It was all about how meaning changes for you over time, and how, you know, when you think you can fully possess what a story means, then you're sort of in trouble, or not in trouble, but you know, you're missing something. And when you talked about the fact that, you know, you'd been the expert on Homer for 35 years, and then in the end you were learning things more than you had ever known, that really resonated and was really special. So thank you.
You're welcome. If I could just say, if you are a fan of Andre Dubus or anybody out there who is, he has a beautiful collection of short essays called Meditations from a Movable Chair, which I teach often, and they are his own personal reflections on his accident. He's hit on the highway one evening as he stops to help a disabled motorist, and he loses one leg and the use of his other leg, so he's wheelchair bound afterward. And he spends a lot of time talking about how his life as a writer helps him process what has happened to him, helps him understand his new place in the world and the figure he cuts in the world. So there, you know, this kind of using literature to help people navigate trauma certainly is not limited to veterans. It can do wonders with all kinds of post-traumatic stress. There are, programs that have literature that use literature to help people with terminal illness, people with have attempted suicide, all kinds of things. Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much. And again, it's so nice to see you.
Maria, John Gallivan has asked this question in the chat. He says, first of all, hello to two of my favorite professors. But he must mean you and you.
Hi, John. And hi, Gina.
Gina's here too. So
nice to hear you both.
Yes, it is. Good to connect with both of you. So John asked, this project sounds a lot like Laura Bates' work, Shakespeare Saved My Life. Have you read that, as one question? And the other is, have you considered turning your project into a book too?
No and yes. No, I haven't read it, and I'd love to know more about it. So maybe you could email me that reference and I'll set about reading quickly. I have thought about turning it into a book. There's a lot of great stuff out there. There's something by a man named Brian Dories called The Theater of War, and his project, reading Greek tragedy and semi-staging Greek tragedy on military bases for veterans or enlisted soldiers dealing with issues of suicide and disfiguring injury. So I think there's an audience out there. I think that I'd need to know a lot more before I could set pen to paper in an authoritative enough way to get the book out there. But yes, I have thought about it, and I think it's something that I know I'd love to do, and that is certainly worth doing. And there's definitely an audience for it. In the middle of the From Troy to Baghdad program, I was a guest, along with two other facilitators. I was a guest on Laura Canoy's program on NPR, and the broadcast got voted the best of the year, which certainly is no credit to me, maybe a credit to Homer, but is definitely an indication that the audience is out there, and people are looking for ways to help, and interest is growing in these issues of Veterans Affairs. So yes, I have thought about it.
That's great. Briefly, the Laura Bates work, she works with prisoners in solitary confinement, and she helps them, but basically they help her understand Shakespeare and his works in a very different way than she expected. And so when you were talking about your experience, it reminded me a lot of her experience with a different group of people and different texts. So this is really interesting. Thanks for sharing this with us.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for that great insight. I will set about reading in my own confinement here. I will set about reading directly because it's amazing. A number of years ago, Professor Rizzo in the Criminal Justice Department started a reading group at the women's prison then in Goffstown. And she had, a number of courses running at the prison, one of which was a philosophy course in which the women there volunteered to read Plato's Republic. And it turned into a very similar kind of experience because the women there were able to start to see justice as a concept that pertained to everyone universally, rather than just limiting themselves to their own experience and the anger they felt at their own experience, or the remorse they felt at their own experience. And they plugged into the idea that they could become more than that experience. And I remember when Elaine talked to me about the project, I said to her, why are you going to read Plato? I'm an idealist, but why would you read Plato at the women's prison? And she said to me, just watch. And she was right. It was a great experience.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff out there. And I more and more as we seem to have to defend the liberal arts within the context of the university, more and more it's kind of seeping out outside that context and doing the things that the liberal arts are meant to do. Deepen people's insights, get them talking and thinking and participating and relating, and that's what they're meant to do.
Well, that's exactly what I just said to John. I said, this is why we love the liberal arts while we're listening to you speak.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there more questions in the queue, do you think? I can't see from where I am.
I guess, Anne-Marie, I'd like you to speak a little bit more about the dangerous art of just making stuff up. And the example I use with current freshmen in Conversatio we are collectively reading The Tempest, have been for the last several years, and Captain Gates was sailing a supply ship with 4 other ships to resupply Jamestown in 1609, and they crashed, and he was lost at sea, et cetera, et cetera. Ends up in Bermuda, and then miraculously, they rebuild 2 ships, and they make it to Jamestown. He was the governor. He was to be the new governor of Jamestown. It all worked out, but they were missing for a year, so it was just the most improbable thing that he showed up. By itself, it is a great story. It's worthy of Homer in some ways, but nobody knows that story. What we know is The Tempest, which Shakespeare wrote very, very loosely based on that account. The only thing we remember from 1610, if we remember anything, is The Tempest. Not Gates or Jamestown or anything else, which was the news of the day. Everybody was talking and writing about that, but it's only The Tempest that we remember. But The Tempest is completely made up, and it has flying fairy and Caliban and who's half fish. The whole thing is just completely made up, but that's the one that lasts. And I think there's the way The Great Gatsby tells us about the Roaring Twenties and Hemingway in war. The stories are just made up. And was that a problem for the veterans at all? Was there an impulse that we want the story told the way it happened? We want the truth, not fictional versions?
No, I don't think so. I think, one of the things that was true about this particular audience reading is that they do know the truth about what war is, which most people don't. And so that's what they looked for in the poem. And they didn't, there were times when I would sort of, get very chatty about look at this simile and look at this imagery and look at the structure of the poem and ring composition and all those things that I like to talk about. And they thought that was interesting and quaint, I suppose. But really what they looked at was experience that they could verify because they shared it. And I think, they enjoyed some of the ways in which the poem is imaginative, because that was a buffer between them and the experience. But no, I think they saw the truth of it very well. Not necessarily the accuracy of it, but they saw the truth of it, and they saw, listening to them read the adventures. I mean, sort of the most fairy tale parts of the poem, and when they talked about the lotus eaters, they would say, well, this is Odysseus battling drugs. We all took drugs in the war. Why wouldn't you take drugs in the war? Why would you not want to be separate from what you were doing every day and seeing every day? So I think from a literary perspective, I think made up stuff adds to the aesthetic, and that adds to the appeal. So for me, beauty is always an important requisite. But I don't think the making up part masks the truth. I think it's an important vehicle for the truth, and it's, you know, a way that people can come at the truth without having to maybe be brutalized by it. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
does.
Okay.
I'm curious, Anne-Marie, this is Daniel Barrett. I graduated from the college decades ago. In the course you taught, was any writing? Did you require any writing? And if so, how did the warriors find that contributed to their own healing?
I didn't require it. I was sort of constrained to some extent in the first iteration because we tried as much as possible to keep all the groups comparable. And there were 4 or 5 going at that first time. I didn't require it, but I encouraged it. I encouraged people to, you know, keep a journal or to find a way to articulate things that they would want to say without feeling that they had to share it once they did. I did move toward, you know, asking them to write some questions about the poem. I gave them discussion questions about the poem, and some of them came in with prepared responses. In the first group, I had one gentleman share with me privately some of his own poetry, which was beautiful. And it took me a while to get him to share some of that with the other vets in the group. He finally did by the end. So I found that a lot of people in the groups did write on their own anyway, but I didn't require any.
Thank you.
One of the things that interested me a lot, so the facilitators were, I mean, I was there to sort of guide through the poem, but the other people there, the veterans and the clinicians, were there to potentially diffuse any situations that became too intense or problematic or harmful in some way. And that never happened. It never happened once. And I was so pleased to see that. We don't want to see anybody hurt. I remember saying to one of the vets with whom I had become very friendly, and his wife, that I had never been in a situation before where I felt like I wielded a kind of power in a text that could hurt someone. That I, you know, might invite them to start down a road that they shouldn't go down. So I was nervous about that, and have become very mindful of that. But we never had that. They supported each other through the difficult conversations. Some of them certainly pulled some punches because I was in the room and there are things they wouldn't say as harshly as they might otherwise. But it was there was healing happening in the room, and that was a wonderful thing to see.
I'm just curious, was there any long-term follow-up in regard to the continuation of the healing? In other words, was the healing just sort of like for a few weeks after the course, or was it, do you know if it was like continual?
I think for some people, yes. So I know that all of the original facilitators are still in touch with some people in their groups. There were some great friendships forged. Out of my first group, there were 3 guys who met each other in the group, and they still have coffee every week, and this is 3 years out now. I am still in touch with a great many of the people in my group. I've become close friends with some of them, and their wives who came back to the second group. So yeah, the process has been ongoing. And after the first group, about 8 of them, I guess, came up to me and said, "You keep talking about this thing called the Iliad. Can we read it? Can we read it together?" And I was concerned because it's a terribly violent poem. But we gave it a shot, and we met on our own for another 10 weeks. and we had a wonderful time. So, and the ones I'm still in touch with are always sending me books to read or asking me to read certain things. Two families have joined the reading group that I run at a parish in Manchester. So yes, I think for some people, yes, the healing has continued. Certainly, I would assume not for everybody, but I'm happy to say that yes. I'm disappointed that at least for the time being we don't have funding to continue the program, but I hope that will change. And I would like to follow up with some of the original participants to see how they're doing and to see if the practice of reading or exploring literature as a way to to help themselves has continued.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? We have a few minutes left if you want to use it.
How do we get in contact with you to learn about any future possible events for that you might be involved in?
Gary or myself? Gary?
Yeah, either just email either you can email either one of us directly, or the Humanities Institute, or the English department, but primarily the Humanities Institute, or just email us directly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing about Anne Maria and I. We're not going anywhere. So, God willing, you can email us there for a long time, and we'll respond, let you know what's going on. We did want to offer a course to the students that Anne Maria was going to teach on this subject, and it didn't enroll. It was a humanities course, and we're expanding by the number of humanities offerings significantly, and that particular one just didn't enroll, but I hope we can do that in the future.
Yes, I'd like to try that again, I think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, I had a lengthy conversation at the end of last week with Anthony Poore, who's the executive director at New Hampshire Humanities, and we, in some ways commiserating about the situation that we all find ourselves in, but also what we've discovered, him in a big way, me in a medium way with the Humanities Institute, is we had never conceived of doing what we're doing tonight. And there's, Christine Ballquist and Dan Barrett and Jerry Canoyer. It's great. John Galvin, you guys are all there. We hadn't really conceived of doing things using the internet, and it was thrust upon us. And so that, whenever we return to whatever normal is, it's also going to include a lot more of this. That you can hold an event on campus and then reach out. If Anne Maria's program with Laura Canoy was the most popular of the year, I mean, that means there's a lot of people who, for whatever reasons, aren't traveling physically to take part in things like this. But the virtual world is going to open up a lot of things, and the humanities have to be at the center of that. They have to be at the center of that. So, by all means, continue to stay in touch with us. We have more alumni reading Shakespeare sonnets Thursday than we've ever had in the history of the festival. And I realize the travel is easy, but that's still great. It's a really exciting thing. So, other questions or comments? We'll let Anne Maria get back to her very, very, very quiet life. And I really want to thank you, Anne Maria, for this. This was great. It puts me in mind. I guess we can let Robert Frost have the last word. The poetry is a way of helping us remember what it would impoverish us to forget. And I think that's what I take away from this tonight. So thank you for the healing you've done for people that we haven't met, and thank you for sharing that with us as and healing us just a little bit in the midst of this crisis.
Well, you're more than welcome. It's been a great pleasure for me. And, you know, I just seeing familiar faces and, you know, kind of makes me even more aware of how closely we are all woven together. And that makes me feel wonderful. And to new faces out there, people I haven't met yet, I hope that this will be the first of any number of things that we get to share.
Very
So
good.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course.
All right. Stay well and safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
too.
So be in touch, please, and we will be in touch with you. Patrice, thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you again.
Okay.
All right.
All right, take care.
Be well. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anne Maria.
You're welcome, Gary. We'll talk soon.
Beautifully done. Stay safe. We'll see you on Thursday.
Okay, yeah, well, you'll see me in some capacity on Thursday.
You'll be reading. You'll be
Oh,
reading.
yeah, I'm reading 131. I'm going to practice all day tomorrow.